Welcome to Identity Engineering with Keith Leonard. This is the show where we break through surface-level change and talk about what really drives transformation, your identity. Each week, we'll explore the psychology, neuroscience, and stories behind how people reinvent who they are from the inside out. So if you're ready to stop trying to change your behavior and start upgrading your identity, you're in the right place.
Welcome to Identity Engineering. I'm Keith Leonard. I want to begin this first episode by saying something that may sound simple, but it's also revolutionary. Most people spend their entire lives trying to change their behavior, to wake up earlier, to stop procrastinating, to eat better, to be more confident, to finally get it together. But deep down, they know something's missing. No matter how many strategies or habits, somehow you end up circling back to the same old patterns. Now, if you've ever felt that frustration, if you've ever felt that pain of, why can't I just follow through? I want you to pay close attention to this. There's nothing wrong with you. You're not broken. You're just working from the wrong level of change. Real transformation doesn't start with behavior. It starts with identity. Now, your identity is the invisible script that tells your mind, this is who I am, this is what people like me do, and this is what's possible for me. And everything in your life, every thought, every emotion, every decision is shaped by that script. So when you try to change your habits without changing your identity, it's like trying to plant roses inside of concrete. Sure, you might see a few blooms for a while, but eventually the roots can't hold and they'll die. See, you don't rise to the level of your goals. You fall to the level of who you believe yourself to be. And that's the heartbeat of this podcast, Identity Engineering. This podcast is about learning how to consciously reprogram who you believe you are, so that the changes you've been chasing start to feel natural, even inevitable. When you upgrade your identity, everything else follows. Your habits align, your confidence rises, your relationships evolve, and you stop forcing change and you start living it. Now, I don't want you to just listen to these episodes. I want you to experience them. Each one is designed to be an exploration, part story, part science, part reflection. So if you can, listen someplace quiet. Let the ideas breathe. Notice what stirs inside of you. Because what we're really doing here is rewriting the story of who you are. And the beautiful thing about stories is that they can always be rewritten. Now, in this first episode, we're going to start at the foundation. We're going to explore the illusion of identity, why so many of us confuse our habits with who we are. I'll share a story about the moment I realized that everything I believed about myself was negotiable, and I'll tell you all about that aha moment that sparked the idea for Identity 2.0. We'll wrap up today with a reflection exercise, a question that has changed the course of so many of my clients' lives, and it might just do the same for you too. So go ahead, take a deep breath, let's settle in, and let's start this journey of remembering and redesigning who you really are. I want to start with a truth that's both liberating and unsettling. Most people never actually meet themselves. Sure, they meet their habits, they meet their history, they meet their conditioning, their layers of roles, routines, and expectations they've picked up along the way. But the real you? The you beneath all of that? That version rarely gets any airtime. From the moment we're born, we start collecting evidence of who we think we are. So every moment of praise, every word of shame, every reaction from the world becomes a data point. And slowly, we start to build a story. I'm smart. I'm shy. I'm the reliable one. I'm the one who always messes things up. These statements feel true because they're familiar, not because they're accurate. And the danger is, we stop seeing them as beliefs and we start treating them as fact. So when you try to make a change, say, start exercising or launch a business or speak with confidence, you're not just fighting a habit, you're bumping up against an identity that says, that's not me. That's why you can know exactly what to do and still not follow through. It isn't because you lack discipline. It's that your brain is wired to stay consistent with the story you tell yourself about who you are. Let me explain this a little deeper. Your unconscious mind has one primary job: to keep you safe. And safety to the unconscious mind doesn't mean happy. It means familiar. So when you try to change something that threatens that familiar sense of self, your brain sounds the alarm. It says, careful, this isn't us, this isn't safe. And suddenly, resistance shows up. You procrastinate. You rationalize. You tell yourself, maybe next week. That's not self-sabotage, it's self-protection. It's your brain defending the old version of you. Now, most people never question that old version. They just assume this is just who I am. But identity is not static. It's a story that we've told ourselves so many times, it just feels like the truth. Look, you weren't born timid, you weren't born confident, impatient, ambitious. You learned those patterns, and then you rehearsed them until they felt natural. And because you rehearsed them long enough, they became your default script. That's why we confuse habits with identity. The repetition of behavior feels like proof of who we are. But here's what I want you to take away from this. Just because something feels true doesn't mean it is true. It just means that it's been practiced. And something that's been practiced can be rewritten. When I first started studying human behavior, through coaching and psychology, and later through my own breakdowns and breakthroughs, I realized that most people are not living as themselves. They're living as a pattern of reactions, beliefs, emotional shortcuts that were installed long before they had a say. That's the illusion of identity. You think you're steering the ship, but most days you're being steered by your programming. And until you pause long enough to question that programming, you can't redesign it. So here's the invitation I want to make to you right now before we go any further. Don't try to fix the you that you think you are. I want you to get curious about the you that you might have outgrown. Because the version of you that's struggling to change isn't broken. It's just outdated software. You know, I used to think that identity was something that you find, sort of like a lost key. That if I just achieved enough, that if I just impressed enough people, or if I just became enough, I'd eventually find myself. And for a number of years, that belief drove me. And so I worked relentlessly. I built a career that I was proud of. I was training leaders. I was helping people create breakthroughs. And from the outside, it probably looked like everything was working. But inside, something wasn't right. There's a unique kind of emptiness that comes when success doesn't feel like success. When you hit milestones that you thought would finally make you happy, and instead of fulfillment, you find this quiet, uncomfortable questioning in the back of your mind that says, why doesn't this feel like me? That's where I was. I was producing results, but I was disconnected from myself. My schedule was full, but my presence was empty. And I kept thinking to myself, maybe if I do just a little more, maybe if I push a little harder, or I achieve the next level, then everything will work out. But it never did. And one night I came back to my hotel after teaching an event that had gone really well. The audience was engaged. People were thanking me afterwards. I did what I always did. I was smiling. I shook hands. I got my stuff together and I went back to my hotel. And when I walked into that hotel room, I remember the silence hitting me like a brick wall. There was no more noise. There was no applause. There was no one waiting to ask questions. Just silence. And I sat there on the edge of my bed, still in my dress shirt, and for the first time in a long time, I asked myself a question that I know I had been avoiding. Who am I when I'm not performing? And that one question cracked something open. Because it was in that moment that I had realized I had built an identity around achievement, around significance, around doing. And the truth was, I didn't know who I was without all of that. Now, it wasn't that I didn't care about my work. I did. I still do. But somewhere along the way, I had started to measure my worth by my output. I was mistaking momentum for meaning. And that realization was very uncomfortable. But it was also the beginning of everything that I teach today. Because as I sat there, I could feel that exhaustion, that fear underneath all of it, that if I ever slowed down long enough to stop doing, I might discover that there was nothing left of me. But that's the lie the old identity tells you. It convinces you that you are your accomplishments, that if you stop chasing, you'll disappear. But that night I started to see the truth. I wasn't empty, I was misaligned. I was living from a version of myself that probably had served me at one point, but now it was suffocating me. So I started asking a very different question. Instead of asking, what do I do next? I started asking, who am I becoming? And that question changed everything. And it didn't happen overnight. I had to dismantle patterns that I had built over years. The need for approval, attachment to results, the addiction to being the one who has all the answers. But little by little, I started remembering who I was before all those roles, before all the pressure, before the world told me who I had to be. And in remembering that, something very powerful happened. The exhaustion softened, the need for approval stopped, and I began to live and work from a place of being, not proving. That's what identity work does. It doesn't turn you into somebody new. It helps you to return to the version of yourself that's always been waiting underneath.
If what you're hearing resonates with you, if you're ready to go deeper into this work, you can explore more inside Keith's book, Identity 2.0, You Are Not Who You Think You Are. It's a step-by-step guide to re-engineering who you believe yourself to be, so change stops feeling forced and starts feeling natural. You'll find the link in the show notes.
After that one night, sitting there in the silence, I couldn't shake that one question of, who am I when I'm not performing? That question stayed with me. It followed me through the next day and the next week and the next few months. And I started to notice how much of my life was built on automatic identity scripts, patterns that I didn't even question anymore. I was the achiever. I was the helper. I was the one that always had the answers. And I realized that for most of my life, I wasn't living from choice. I'd been living from conditioning. But here's what I found really fascinating. Once I began observing those patterns, instead of reacting to them, I started to see them for what they were. They weren't me. They were programs. They were little mental routines that told me how to act, how to feel, what to believe was possible. It was like waking up inside my own code. And I remember vividly, I was sitting in my office one day, and there was no noise, there was no distraction. It was just me, my notebook, a cup of coffee, and I was trying to write down a way to describe everything as I was experiencing. And I came to this conclusion that if identity is a software, then transformation is probably just a matter of upgrading the code. And once I reached that realization, it felt electric. It was like the missing piece that I was looking for. Because up until that point, I had been teaching people tools, leadership models, strategies, and they all worked, but only for a while. Right? Clients and students were making progress. They would feel amazing. But then months later, some of them would slide right back into the old version of themselves. And they weren't losing motivation. They were being pulled back by the gravity of their identity. And that was the light bulb moment for me. I realized that real change doesn't come from doing more. It comes from becoming someone new, becoming the type of person where new behavior is natural. And that's when Identity 2.0 began to form. Not as a book yet, not even as a concept that I plan to teach. It started as a personal experiment. I wanted to see what would happen if I stopped trying to fix behaviors and instead started working on the invisible layer underneath them, the beliefs, the values, the self-concept, the code that everything else runs on. So I started asking different questions, both for myself and for my students. How do I make this change stick? That was the old question. That was the question I had been asking all along. But now it was time to change that question. The new question was, who would I need to be in order for this change to feel effortless? Who would I have to be to hold myself back? Those questions changed everything. Because now all of a sudden I started seeing people transform not just temporarily, permanently. And they weren't forcing new behaviors, they were living them. Confidence, health, financial success, love. These things stopped being goals, and they started being natural expressions of who they believed themselves to be. That was the essence of Identity 2.0. It was never about self-improvement. It was always about self-reconstruction. Identity 2.0 is about realizing that you're not a fixed character in your story. You're the author, you're the editor, and the publisher all at once. And when I saw how quickly things began to change for myself, for my clients, for my students, I knew that this was the work that I was meant to do. Not to teach people what to do, but to help them remember who they are beneath everything they've been taught to believe. And I can tell you, once you see identity as something that you can engineer, it's almost impossible to see yourself the same way again. And you stop asking questions like, what do I need to fix about myself? And instead you start asking, who am I becoming? That one change from self-judgment to self-design is the moment that transformation stops being a struggle and it starts becoming effortless. When people hear the word identity, they usually think of personality, traits, labels, characteristics. They'll say things like, I'm an introvert, I'm a perfectionist, I'm not the kind of person that takes risks, or I've always been this way. That's not identity. That's the surface code. That's the part you can see. But underneath all that is something deeper, something much more fundamental. It's the layer that tells your mind how to interpret the world, what to focus on, what to ignore, and what's possible for someone like you. That layer is your operating system. Think about it like this. Every computer, every phone, every smart device has an operating system that determines how it runs. And you could change the wallpaper, you could rearrange the apps, you can even upgrade the hardware. But if the operating system hasn't been updated, the same bugs, the same glitches, the same limitations keep showing up over and over again. That's exactly how identity works. You can install new habits. Those are the apps. You can update your environment. That's the hardware. You can even learn new skills. That's like improving your processing power. But if you're still running the same internal code that says, I'm not disciplined, I'm not lucky, I never finish what I start, then every new behavior will eventually get overridden by your old programming. The behavior fails not because the strategy is wrong, but because the identity running it was outdated. Now, your identity determines three things automatically without you ever needing to think about them. First, it defines what you pay attention to. Second, it decides what meaning you assign to what you see. And third, it dictates what actions feel natural to you. If your identity is, I'm a confident person, then opportunities feel like invitations. But if your identity is, I'm not confident, then those same opportunities can feel like threats. You see the difference? It isn't the world that's changing, it's you. When I started to look at identity as an operating system instead of a personality, it explained so much about human behavior. It's why people can read 100 self-help books and still feel stuck. It's why people can make money, lose it, and then make it again, because the identity of someone who creates wealth is still installed. And it's why someone can lose a relationship and end up recreating the exact same relationship with a different person, because their identity keeps running the same emotional code. That realization is where the phrase identity engineering came from. Because if your operating system can be written, it can be rewritten. Now think about what that really means. It means that every belief, every habit, every automatic response you've ever learned was once a program. Someone modeled it, someone taught it, someone repeated it around you. And your brain, in its effort to make sense of the world, said, okay, I'll store that as truth. And if those patterns were learned, they can be unlearned. If they were installed, they can be uninstalled. And if they were coded, they could be reprogrammed. When you start to see yourself that way, the entire idea of personal growth changes. You don't have to add more effort. You simply have to remove old code that no longer serves you. And you don't become someone new. You simply are removing what's false so what's true can run again. So when I say that identity is your operating system, I'm not speaking in metaphors. Your nervous system, your emotional patterns, your habitual language, all of it functions like code. And when you upgrade the code, the system, your life, everything updates automatically. That's what we're going to explore throughout this podcast. How you can recognize the old patterns that no longer serve you, how you can design the identity that supports your next chapter, and how to keep that system aligned. So you don't just change, you become. Because when you reprogram the operating system of who you are, your thoughts, your behaviors, and the results all follow effortlessly. Before we wrap up today, I want to invite you to pause. Just stop doing whatever you're doing for a moment and just be. Wherever you are, walking, driving, sitting in a quiet room, I want you to just take a slow, deep breath in through your mouth, let it out through your nose, and as you exhale, notice how your shoulders drop and relax. Now I want you to imagine that everything that you've been doing lately, every goal, every habit, every decision, is happening on the surface of your life, like waves on the ocean. But beneath those waves, there's something deeper, still, steady, a presence that's always been there. That's you. That's the real you. Not the version that tries to prove something, or please everyone, or hold everything together. Not the identity that was shaped by old roles, old fears, or other people's expectations, but the you who's always known that there's more to you than the story you've been living. That's the version I want to speak to right now. I want you to ask yourself one question, and not just think about it, feel it. Who have I been pretending to be? Let that question land. Don't try to answer it immediately. Just notice what shows up. Maybe you've been pretending to be strong when you're exhausted. Maybe you've been pretending to be confident when you've been doubting yourself. Maybe you've been pretending to be content with a life that just doesn't fit anymore. Whatever surfaces, let it. No judgment, no analysis, just awareness. Awareness is the first rewrite of identity. You can't change what you can't see. And the moment you see the role you've been playing, you begin to remember the one who's been playing it. This is where freedom begins. So here's your practice for the next few days. Find 5 minutes each morning before the world starts pulling at you and sit with that one question again. Who have I been pretending to be? Write down whatever comes through. And then, when you're ready, ask the next question. Who am I ready to become? That's the shift from identity by default to identity by design. The person you long to be is not out of reach. They're already there inside of you. They're just waiting for permission to lead. And that permission begins the moment you stop pretending. In the next episode, we'll take this exploration even further. We'll talk about the architecture of change, the levels that shape every transformation, and why so many people struggle because they're trying to create change at the wrong level. So until then, take a deep breath and remember, you are not who you think you are. You are who you decide to become. I'm Keith Leonard. Thank you for listening to Identity Engineering. I'll see you in the next episode.
Thank you for listening to Identity Engineering. If today's episode sparked something in you, subscribe or follow wherever you listen and share it with someone who's ready to see themselves differently. Remember, identity isn't fixed, it's designed. Every thought, every habit, every decision is another brushstroke in the masterpiece of who you're becoming. And remember, you are not who you think you are. You are who you decide to be next.